This is the Iron Sharpens Iron movement, sharing insights into the power of people-centric leading.
Hi, this is Jim, and today we welcome to our tribe an internationally renowned expert on stress mitigation and self-regulation for optimal performance in human beings seeking to improve better quality of life. His company has trained over 20,000 people in high-stress, high-performance jobs such as law enforcement, private industry, and special operation forces, including Air Force Special Tactics, Army Green Berets, and Navy SEALs. The founder behind the Science of Human Resilience, Stephen Robinson. The Iron Sharpens Iron movement is brought to you by N2 Growth, a leader in executive search, leadership development, and talent management. We find and develop the world's best leaders. Learn more about our practice by visiting us at n2growth.com or click on the link in the show notes of this podcast. Well, Stephen, thanks for joining our Iron Sharpens Iron tribe today. This is a special episode. We are in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis, and this special episode I thought was very important to bring you on. You're not only a business acquaintance, but a very close friend of mine, and I thought there's no other person in the world that could talk to our audience about resilience and stress and improving performance, lowering anxiety, how to self-regulate yourself, all of the things that I think 99% of the general population, probably in the world, is going through right now. So we welcome you to this episode.
Jim, thank you. I'm honored to be on with you. And I know over this next little bit, we're going to share some ideas that your listenership is going to benefit from.
Yeah, you bet. Stephen, you work for a company where you're the founder of a company called Even Pulse, and I'm familiar with you with even working within the Air Force. I know that you're one of the vendors that goes out there and teaches resilience to our airmen in the United States Air Force. But this isn't something that's military at all. This is a process that you and your wife have created based on science. And I'd like for you to just kind of talk about, everybody uses the word resilience, right? But is it really defined? How do you see resilience? And talk to us about some of the things, some of the methodologies that you have gone out and have, refined through the years that really anybody that's listening to this podcast could take hold of and change their lives with.
Yeah, absolutely, Jim. Resilience is usually characterized around the ability to bounce back or to be able to deal with challenges. And I think there's a lot of conceptual framework there and not necessarily enough teeth of like, how do you, from a skills-based standpoint, work with the exigencies as they come up? And obviously with COVID-19 and what's happened in the market over these last weeks and months, I think many of us are being tested at such a deep level, but it's incredible how much of our focus ends up going outside of ourselves to focus on what's the latest data, how many people have died, where's the proliferation of the virus happening, et cetera. While all that stuff is important to an extent to at least stay abreast of and be aware of, I think there's a much deeper opportunity for people to go within and really examine their own resources in their toolkit.
So you're talking about things that you can control, not things that you can't control.
Absolutely. I mean, I think really the essence of how to attack this is to look at our locus of control. And I would encourage your listenership to write down what are the 4 or 5 things that I know right off the top of my head as I look within. What are the things that are within my locus of control and what's outside of that? And make sure that that's clearly defined. You can even draw a circle and say, what are all the things that are outside of my locus? Write those down. And then what's inside that wheelhouse? What's inside my circle?
And you gave some great examples of what's outside of your control. What are some good examples of what's inside your control?
So your attitude and approach. So as you look at opportunities and say, okay, well, here are all these things that are outside of my locus, but my own attitude, the way I view things through the prism of my own mind and brain, working with your breath, working with your posture. How am I spending my time during this period so that I'm productive and constructive rather than unproductive and destructive?
Do you find a lot of things that I talk about in the podcast in general is about human centric leading and about understanding the human themselves. Can you talk to me a little bit about your perception of the power of a human and also the frailty of a human? This control that you talk about, most of us are vulnerable to that. Most of us don't actually like looking in the mirror and internalizing some of these things. Um, how do you go after that from a human point of view?
Well, I think the first thing, Jim, is to look at our cultural fear of our own death. One thing that I learned from a lot of the special operators that I interviewed over the years is that there's a confronting of the imminence of one's own death in that field. This also harkens back to some of the early reading I did from Carlos Castaneda's work, where Don Juan, his mentor, would say, a great warrior confronts the imminence of his or her own death constantly. And therefore, we have the ability to live in the present moment in a more powerful and dynamic way.
Oh, can you say that last sentence again? Because I'm telling you, I'm writing that down and putting that in a sticky right on my computer.
A warrior confronts the imminence of his or her own death and therefore is able to live in the present moment in a more dynamic and engaged way.
That's pretty powerful. That's pretty powerful stuff.
Well, what I see coming out of this is that so many of us are looking at our own mortality. And I think as a culture, both in the US and in the West in general, there's an aversion to look at death and recognizing that through this, hey, we're all going to pass at some point, whenever that point is. I don't know when that is for me. I don't know when that is for you or anybody else. But in looking at this, I think there's a very deep and rich opportunity for us to become more immersed in who we are and who we can be.
Would you also equate or talk to me maybe about the difference then? I think most people at home right now, we're at the height of the crisis, the COVID epidemic that's going on, the pandemic. And maybe it's not death, but it's fear of the unknown.
Hmm.
Would you put that in the same category as, every day people aren't potentially living in the presence because they're afraid of death, like you just referred to, but is it also just that fear of the unknown? Is it the same paralyzing effect?
Yeah, I think to a large degree it is. Uncertainty and unpredictability are something that human beings don't necessarily deal well with. But I think, at least from my perch, resilience is all about dealing with uncertainty and unpredictability. In the trauma field, I know many people who study post-traumatic stress say that the aversion to unpredictability is one of the common impacts of trauma. And I also see this current crisis as a cultural traumatization, much like 9/11. While that was an event, and this is more of a rolling, sort of ongoing, unfolding series of events, it still has some of the same similarities. And I think that can cast people into the freeze mechanism.
One of my outside observations to this is, in the military, when I was in the military and in special operations, we found that our levels of PTS were lower than a general population within the military because we were training for those high trauma events, those high impact events. You knew it was coming. You were mentally running through it, and your resilience levels were just naturally high in preparation for a traumatic event. So, in today's world, would you say that there's a potential for a lower level of resilience uh, in most people today because they weren't really preparing for this? This came very sudden, even though it's rolling right now. And I'm thinking of the folks, not even the doctors and the nurses and the EMS workers and law enforcement and military, but the grocery store workers, the restaurant workers, the sanitation workers, the folks that still have to show up for work every single day to keep us going. They now are the heroes, but they weren't mentally rehearsing a month ago that they now were going to be put in this heroic kind of pedestal. That might be the wrong word, but in position, I would say. Um, but they weren't rehearsing for it mentally, more than likely. Would you say now is probably a greater time than ever before that people should start talking about resilience and some methodologies to resilience?
Yes, I mean, I think that we've probably never had a more critical moment in American history and Western history to really examine what are our resources, how do we go within, and I think your example of the special operations field in general is a great one because there is a cultural preparation for trauma and intense activity is happening on a mental, physical, emotional, spiritual plane, and the average person usually doesn't think like that. And the traumatologist and neurologist we've worked with for so many years, Dr. Robert Scare, once told me that he said that surprise is another word for trauma. And
Hmm.
so when things are shocking and they shock the senses on every level in such a fundamental way, many people are overwhelmed by that. And I think those who are really well prepared at a deep level inside themselves, they've already taken themselves into that space where their mind and brain have essentially been there. They're just much more apt to be able to cope with whatever shows up.
And there certainly is nothing wrong with admitting that you're not ready for this. Again, I don't want to generalize when I say a general population or, folks that weren't prepared for that. That is not a negative term at all. It's just a realization of what you had just said. They probably weren't focusing on preparation for a very traumatic event in their lives because let's be grateful that not everybody does have to try to focus on these events every single minute of their lives.
Absolutely. And I think there's a lot of power, and actually the science supports this, that when we take ownership of being able to say, I am not very well prepared for this. There's a naming and taming of our own internal state in which we can say, hey, well, the reality is I'm not working all that well with this, or I feel anxiety. So just in my saying that, if I'm actually feeling anxiety and I state that, I'm actually going to shunt more blood flow to the left frontal cortex of my brain and away from my right amygdala, which is helping to trigger a continual fear response.
So, Stephen, I know that you've worked for years really kind of dialing in a methodology that is something that people can wrap their minds around a little bit on kind of the full circle of resilience. Could you spend a few moments talking about your methodology and how it relates to anybody that could be even listening to this? I know that there's some in depth training that we could all attend and really get down to a deeper level. But, for the short amount of time that we've got you today, are there some things that a person could at least walk through in their head that would be tangible to them, that could really help them out as we're sitting here at the height of the epidemic?
Yes, I mean, I would say the first and foremost skill to go to is to be aware of your physical body through your breath. One of the things that happens is that when we are stressed or having a traumatic reaction to things, is we'll either A, dissociate, or B, begin to just get sort of disconnected from being physically present in our body. So the best thing we can do, first and foremost, is to take that slow, full, deep breath and be aware of what does that air feel like going into my lungs? How do I inhabit my body? Because this is where stuff happens. It happens through and inside of this physical organism that we're built into. And I think it's so easy to check out of that, especially in the digital age where our attention gets sucked away from us and not into being physically present.
And there's a lot of things out there now about breathing techniques. Is there a certain, when you're taking in these breaths, I've always heard of, a different inhale and then a hold and an exhale and things like that. Do you have a particular breathing style that you recommend?
Oh gosh, there's a myriad of techniques available. There's the box breath. There's extending the exhale to slow one down. There's all sorts of different techniques. Um, my personal favorite is to work with an extended exhale. So if I feel stressed or I feel anxious or what have you, just by simply taking a full inhale, let's just say we'll do this now. Take a 3-second inhale and then pause and then extend the exhale at least twice as long as the inhale. So as you notice how you feel in your body, did you have more control of the exhale or the inhale? And what's happening is when I extend the exhale in that way, I'm bringing the parasympathetic or the slow down side of my nervous system online. I'm beginning to slow my heart rate. I'm beginning to increase my heart rate variability. So there's so many positive benefits that come from it. And the number one is you're putting on the brakes. So you're literally telling your body, I'm not in fight or flight. I'm right here in this moment, and I'm controlling one thing that nobody else can take away from me, unless maybe you've got your knee on my chest and you're pressing into my xiphoid process and I can't breathe.
That I felt I did the exercise with you, and I could feel the difference. And is it best to do that? When do you do that? When you feel stress is coming on, when you're starting to have that awareness that you're starting to become overwhelmed? Do you do it when you first wake up?
Yeah, it's funny. One of our trainers asked me not too long ago, "How often are you aware of your breathing? Like in a course of an hour?" And I said, "Every 10 minutes maximum." So I'd say in every 10-minute cycle, I'm finding all sorts of reference points that whether it's me getting up from a chair or sitting down in a chair or walking to the bathroom or taking a drink of water, I've got all sorts of different touch points that keep bringing my attention back to that. And that way it drives me back into my body and says, okay, no matter what's going on in my environment, I always go back to that.
I love that. And so would you say that is the most important first step when someone's starting, they're listening to this podcast, they clicked on it because it talks about resilience during this crisis time in our world, that this is the first thing you lean to? Is this number one? I'm feeling stress. I'm overwhelmed. I've just been laid off at work. The kids are at home. I'm trying to sit down and find some quiet time. Is this the first thing you do?
Absolutely. And, one of the reasons is the mind can spin up all sorts of conjecture and possibilities of things that might happen, many of which might not have even happened yet. But, we have this train wreck of our life appearing to unfold in which, first I'm losing my job and then my spouse leaves me and then I wind up under a bridge abutment drinking out of a poly bottle. It's it's funny that the
Yep.
mind can do amazing things really quickly. So you reel all
Yep.
that back in and say, right now, what really is happening in my environment? Well, let's start with my internal environment because that's the one that's most important, and then
Right.
I can deal with my external environment from there.
So that awareness, because when you said right now, I almost imagine myself clapping that right now. Is that just snapping you back into reality? It's getting all of those things that are dancing in your head to go away for that moment and bring that awareness hyper right back into your locus of control that we started the episode out on.
Yes, and I'll give you an example. I worked with a sports psych years ago, and I was playing tennis. I played professional tennis at kind of a journeyman level. But this guy that I worked with down in Florida was like, okay, well, one of the first things I want to teach you is you have to slay the demons, the dragons of your own mind. And the worst voice you'll ever hear is also the best voice you'll ever hear,
Hmm.
which is your own. and, and so learn to listen to that. But when it starts to tell you stuff that's not particularly constructive, or it tells you all the reasons that your life is a big 3-ring shit show, or it's going to go south, you tell that voice, shut up.
Huh.
And stop it in its tracks to say, what I need to do right now is I need to arrest and control, which is what I often say to cops when we work with them. You need to arrest and control your own mind.
Oh, wow. So if you can control your present thoughts, do you work on controlling your thoughts? Do you, once you snap it into place, you kind of, get it back to its right place of mindset? Do you start to project in the future too? I mean, like, I've heard you talk in the past about like simulating and things like that. Is that the power of the mind too?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think directing attention is a hugely important part of resilience. So many of us get swept away by our thoughts because we think that we are our thoughts, but nothing
Huh.
could be further from the truth. I think in one sense, when you stop and become really present and you're not thinking, then you're in a position of real power because the thinking is part of the problem because science has actually shown us that almost 50% of the time the average adult human is either ruminating about bad stuff that's happened from their past or they're projecting forward into bad things that might happen in their future. So we have a negativity bias anyway, and of course, science has shown us that the brain very powerfully records the negative for future reference. Because if things like that happen, well, we want to be aware if saber-toothed tiger jumps out, or if the market crashes, or whatever that might happen. We want to be prepared for those eventualities, and we get coded in part by that.
Awesome. I love the fact that you've started to figure out that, us as humans, we still have complete control over ourselves, and so, by starting with that breathing, by making sure those demons in your brain are silenced and you're brought back right here, right now. And that you can also recognize the fact that most of the things that are spinning around in your head are just movies and not reality, in the past or in the future and all of those kind of things. Is there any other tips and tricks that you think are important for people as they're listening that would be of value today?
Yeah, well, you mentioned simulation. I think our own head shed is the most powerful creative machine that we could have ever come up with. I mean, our imagination is a superpower. And what I want to encourage the audience to think about is, what are you simulating? What are you imagining? So as you look at COVID, as you look at what's happened in the market, where do you see your business going? Where do you see you going? And so if you're simulating, you're rehearsing all of the possible scenarios. And yeah, it's great to be able to play out the what ifs. And as a business person, of course, I always run a SWOT analysis and look at the strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats. But if I'm spending most of my time on the threats, I'm going to miss really focusing on the opportunities, such as, what's going to happen in the next 6 weeks or 6 months in the market, and how can we, as a business, or me as an individual, how can each one of us step forward in a more profound and powerful way?
What would be a reality? I mean, do you try to be so self-aware that if you have a negative thought, you try to turn it on its head and look for the positive side of that victim victor kind of scenario?
Yeah, I certainly think that that's a key skill. One of the tricks that I use is, if I have that pop up, I'll observe it and say, "That's interesting." And so
Huh.
just by doing that, I'm also shunting blood flow again to the left frontal cortex. And when I'm in a state of wonderment, or fascination, or just simply observation, I'm diffusing the negative energy around it, which is helping to mobilize my fight or flight system that says, hey, I got to be ready to run for my life or fight for my life against this perceived threat. Or I just observe it and say, hey, well, maybe it's a useful thought. Maybe it's that worrying thought is actually preparing me for another as if scenario, or something that might come down the pike. But many times I think, we're just spinning up more things that are taking us into a, sort of chasing our tail scenario.
Yeah, very true. You talked in there about energy. Can you talk to me about how do you manage that? And so when I think stress, I always I self reflect on when I get stressed or flustered, then the blood's rushing to my head. Face turns red. My heart rate's going up much faster. All of those kind of things. Is that, I guess, is negative energy? And how does all this relate to kind of regulating energy and managing it, and my emotions too, I guess?
Yeah, it's funny. Years ago, I came up with an acronym, of course, because I've done so much work with the military over the years, and the military loves acronyms. I thought of,
Yeah.
of the word fear, and I said, hey, what is the basis of fear? And then I looked at it from a nervous system standpoint, and I said, hey, this is the fundamental energy activation response,
Huh.
FEAR. And if you think about it from a primal standpoint, as an organism, as a human being, but we've got this kind of mammal and even lizard side of us. So if you look at the triune brain theory, anyway, um, if you look at the fundamental energy of what we are at the most base level, we are built to be able to run for our lives, or fight for our lives if necessary, or even freeze in place. If we were succumbing to a predator, that's part of a natural opiating process that we have built into us as well. But the fight, flight, freeze is down at the core of us, and that's true for humans, mammals, and reptiles. And what I want to encourage people to look at is, what is the fundamental energy coursing through you right now? And is it more of that fight, flight, freeze response? Or are you stepping into the human potential of who you are, where you can observe that in yourself and say, hey,
Mm.
right now, I don't need you primitive response. I need to commandeer this conversation in my head, be present in my body to this fear factor, but I'm now going to strategically move forward while I'm present, and I also remain connected to the people around me.
That's pretty powerful. That's pretty powerful. The most I'm getting out of this conversation is just the power of you. Like, you do have control over yourself. You just have to be aware of it and be present and understand all of these different dynamics that are coming from all different angles and still be in control of it. Do you
Yeah.
have so when we talk, Stephen, about, like, do you wake up and start your breathing and being aware? And you're like, well, I do that no less than every 10 minutes of my waking moments. And as we travel through awareness and simulation and kind of, discovering these energies that are in you, is there you know how do you go to sleep then, I guess? So you've gone through these moments, you've tried to regulate your stress and your anxiety and control it and all of that. How do you end these days? How do do you find people that are very tense? How do you shake it off, I guess, is the big thing. I know there are some days lately that I'm physically exhausted just by stress.
Yeah, I mean, I think so many of us are, Jim. And if you look at the news, and it's often said, if it bleeds, it leads. Um, Whether you're watching the Weather Channel or you're in any kind of news feed, there's so much information that comes in that tells us that these impending dooms are facing us. And right now I'm actually looking out my window at these beautiful pine trees and spruces and the mountains in the distance. And if I were to look at a news feed, I could see all sorts of things that would tell me that there's something calamitous about to happen. But if I
Hmm.
observe my immediate environment, it's absolutely beautiful outside. There are no planes flying around right now. It's super quiet here up in this mountain area that I live in. And I look at the environment and go, is there any actual threat to me here right now? And probably the greatest threat I have is my own mind and brain and where I let it go. So I want to encourage people to take news fasts. The news is still going to be there tomorrow. It's still going to be there in 5 minutes. But I think it's easy to get swept away by looking at all that information and say, I've got to keep my finger on this pulse constantly. And that's one of the reasons we called the company Even Pulse, because we felt like having that evenness inside of us and checking our own pulse is the most important pulse to check.
I'm going to admit a secret to you. When you were just talking about that, I actually spun my podcast chair around and looked out my window into the tree line and just listened to your words. And I will tell you, my stress levels have just come down by listening to your words about how I need to control my realities and how it absolutely is beautiful outside my window right now. And that is the reality that I am facing. And it's not the stuff that's stuck between my ears. That's
Mm.
pretty powerful stuff, Stephen. I appreciate that right now, because even in the 20 minutes that we've been talking, just taking that one moment in time right there is probably some of the greatest advice that I've ever had. So, we wanted to keep this special episode a little short for the fact that if you're commuting still, or if you're out on that run, if you're taking a walk with the family and you happen to be listening to the podcast, or if you just need kind of a soothing voice out there, we wanted to keep it kind of short and succinct today. And we know that there is, Stephen, I'd love to bring you back and we really deep dive into almost everything that we talked about, because we know there's so much that you have to offer us. But if you were to give us some parting words about the life that we're all in right now as a global community, I'd love to give you the floor right now to talk to us.
Well, the one thing I would say is absolutely paramount is learn how to turn on your vagus nerve. The vagus is a tenth of the cranial nerves. It innervates in the face, in the voice box, in the lungs, the heart, the gut. Vagus means wandering, same root as vagabond, vagaries, etc. And it's really the key to relaxation. I think one of the real challenges for our cultures right now, and I mean world culture, is that people in the face of fear and uncertainty find it incredibly difficult to relax. And the vagus essentially governs that. One of the things that helps turn on the vagus is facial attunement. And so if we see a friendly face, even if that's our own face in the mirror, or if it's a loved one, that kind face helps turn the vagus on. And there are lots of different ways to do it. Slow, deep breathing, of course, is one of them. As we go forward, and maybe if I'm back on again with you at some point, I can talk about strategies of how to do that, because that's a big central focal point in our training.
Well, I think we all need to see smiling faces. That's for sure. And I think we all have it in us. We're going to come out of this together as a global community. America will be stronger than ever. The sense of local community will be stronger than ever, and we'll rise up again, and we'll be even better for it. But it certainly doesn't hurt that there's more smiling faces, more resilient people out there, and those that become aware of, you don't have to listen to all those voices in your head, but control what you can control. So, Stephen, thanks, even in these worst scenarios, that you taught us how to face adversity head on, that we do control this, that there are ways to manage it and use it for our strengths. And we certainly thank you, the tribe of listeners. Thank you for coming on for this special episode. We thought this would be a great time to hear your expertise and just give us a little sense of our control in our lives through resilience, through managing resilience, and we're better for it. So thanks again.
Yeah, I'm honored and delighted to be with you. And everybody out there, keep breathing, keep turning on that vagus, keep going forward.
Thanks for joining our leadership movement this week, talking to Stephen about resilience and the focus on controlling what you truly can control is a timely discussion during this pandemic. Don't forget, our show notes are posted on the website with key leader takeaways and suggested action plans. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast and tell a friend so we can continue to build our tribe. Join our Facebook group to get even more behind-the-scenes action and exclusive content for leaders. Until next time, always remember that iron sharpens iron. Make yourself and others around you better every day.